January 6, 1945, was intended as a return, not as a beginning, not as a sacrifice, but as routine. A transport aircraft took off in Kunming, on a route that everyone on board already knew. The engines found their steady rhythm, a sound meant to be reassuring. The aircraft carried an identification, a serial number, a list of names. By the end of that day, nothing remained of it except in files. Second Lieutenant Sidney L. Murphy sat in the left seat. His gloves lay heavy around the control yoke, the metal beneath cool despite the gloves. He checked the instruments a second time, a habit, not an order. Among his personal belongings, he had stowed the ribbon of his Distinguished Flying Cross. Not visible, only tangible. Years earlier, he had told his parents in California, "I fly supply routes. Nothing special." He had meant it. Routine was his protection against fear. In the fuselage sat William K. Scherer, passenger, not part of the crew. But just as vulnerable, he carefully folded a letter, always along the same line. In his inner pocket, he carried a small photo of his son, taken during his first uncertain steps. "This is just a ride, not a mission," he had said while boarding, more to himself than to anyone else. No one contradicted him. The aircraft disappeared without a distress call. No voice on the radio, no smoke signal, no witnesses on the ground. 13 men were suddenly unreachable. Military administration registered the loss almost immediately. A search procedure began, ended, was signed off. Forms were filled out, chalk wiped from a board. Operations could not stall. For the families, something else began. Not an event, but a condition. Bill Scherer, then a toddler, grew up in this condition, with a father who was officially missing and practically unreachable. Knowledge without explanation. Loss without image. What happened in the last minutes? Why was nothing found? And what does it mean to be lost when the loss has long been documented? There was only the date, the flight, the aircraft number. No debris, no remains. Only names that were immediately missing, and decades later, still waiting. The morning in Kunming began without urgency. No alarm, no call, no sign that this day would differ from the many before. It was still dark, but no longer night. A pale, cold light lay over the airfield, mixed with haze, exhaust fumes, and the smell of damp concrete. Men moved between the machines with the routine slowness of people who had learned to conserve their strength. Boots crunched on frozen ground. Somewhere, a metal door slammed shut, not loud enough to stand out. Sidney L. Murphy was awake before anyone called him. He almost always was. Mid-20s, slender build, his face younger than his rank suggested. He had gotten into the habit of getting up early, even when the flight schedule didn't require it. Time before takeoff meant control. Control meant safety. At least it felt that way. He sat on the edge of his cot, pulled on his boots, tied them carefully, always in the same rhythm. 2 loops, 1 pull, a brief glance. Outside, he could already hear the first engine starting up. The sound was deep, impatient, familiar. He reached for his jacket, briefly felt the weight of things in the pockets. Maps. Notes. In a narrow cloth pouch lay the ribbon of his Distinguished Flying Cross. He didn't have it out of vanity. He had brought it because he didn't know where else to put it. Some things you didn't leave behind. On the way to the airfield, he accepted the cup of coffee someone handed him. Thin, bitter, barely warm. He didn't grimace. He always drank it. Coffee before the first flight was part of his order. A small ritual against unpredictability. He stood still for a moment, the cup warming his fingers. The sky over Kunming was gray, heavy, without contours. Not a good day, but not an unusual one either. The machine was already waiting. The Curtiss transport looked larger in the twilight than during the day. The outer skin was cold, almost damp. Murphy laid his hand on it, as he often did. Not out of technical necessity, but to assure himself that it was real. Metal responded honestly. It was either there or not. He liked that. In the cockpit, it smelled of oil, of fabric, of something electrical. He sat down, laid out the maps, checked the checklist. His fingers moved confidently, almost automatically, instrument by instrument, oil temperature, pressure, fuel. And then again, always twice. An instructor had once asked him if he was afraid. Murphy had shaken his head. "I just like it right," he had said. That was closer to the truth. While he worked, he briefly thought of California, of his parents, of the train station where they had said goodbye. The smell of coal, the sound of the train starting. His mother had tried to sound calm. "Write when you can," she had said. His father had nodded, said nothing. Murphy had smiled. "I fly supply routes," he had explained. Nothing heroic. He had believed those words could protect. Behind him, the aircraft began to fill. The passengers came quietly, individually or in pairs. No conversations that stuck. William K. Scherer was one of them. Early 30s, shoulders slightly forward, as if carrying an invisible weight. He held an envelope in his hand, folded it again, though it was already neat. He had perfected this movement. Folding meant order. Order meant control. Scherer sat down on one of the narrow benches along the fuselage. The seat was hard, the belt old but functional. He pulled the blanket over his knees. It was cold. He knew it would get colder. In the inner pocket of his jacket was a small photo of his son. The paper had become soft at the edges. He had taken it out often, looked at it often, put it away again often. He thought of the moment when he had taught the boy to walk, how the little one had fallen, laughed, gotten up again. "This is just a ride, not a mission," Scherer said quietly, more to himself than to the man next to him. No one contradicted him. In the cockpit, Murphy signed the flight log. A brief moment. His name, the time. This line connected him to all the lines before. Each promised a return. He didn't think about it. That was the point of routine, not having to think. The engine started. The sound grew louder, vibrated through the fuselage. Murphy felt it in his feet, in his back. He smelled briefly. No sweet smell, no smoke, just oil and metal. He thought of fire. It was his concrete fear. Not crash, not mountains. Fire. Flames that couldn't be extinguished, high up, with no way out. He had read reports. He had seen men who didn't want to talk about it. That's why he always smelled. That's why he paid attention to every deviation. The takeoff was clean. The machine accelerated, lifted off, heavy but controlled. Kunming disappeared beneath them, became shapes without meaning. Murphy pointed the nose west. Ahead lay a route he knew. He had flown it often. Familiarity was deceptive, but it made one bold. In the cargo hold, the men held onto the belts. Some closed their eyes. Others stared at their hands. Scherer pulled out the letter again, folded it anew, smoothed the edge with his thumb. He thought of the end of the war, of civilian clothes, of a table where everyone sat. He didn't think of danger. Danger was abstract. Future was concrete. Murphy adjusted the instruments. A small deflection, nothing unusual. He took a sip of water. It tasted metallic, cold. He briefly twisted his mouth. Then he smiled, without noticing. Routine had carried him this far. It would bring him back too. That's what he assumed. The clouds grew thicker. The light changed. Murphy adjusted the power. Calm, practiced. He heard the radio, the static, the voices of other aircraft. Everything seemed normal. That's exactly what was dangerous. Normalcy made you blind. In the fuselage, someone shifted, pulled the blanket tighter. A man coughed briefly. Scherer put the photo away, placed his hands in his lap. He thought of his wife, of her look at parting, of the promise to be back soon. Promises were easy to give when the path seemed familiar. Murphy looked at the displays again. Everything in the green range. He thought of the next entry in the flight log, of the landing, of the moment when the engines would be shut off. He didn't think about what lay between. No one did. Between takeoff and landing was work, nothing more. Outside, a landscape passed that no one could see. Beneath the clouds, mountains began that didn't announce themselves. They waited. The machine flew on, carrying not cargo, but people, hopes, habits, small decisions that had felt right. This flight was no exception. That's exactly what made it so final. Part 2. The loss. The loss didn't begin with a sound. It began with time that passed without being noticed. In Chabua, the large operations board hung as on any other day on the wall of the operations room. Dark wood, dull from years of wiping. Chalk remnants lay in fine lines at the lower edge, traces of past days, past flights. Names never stood there long. Flight numbers came, disappeared, made room for new ones. Times were noted, corrected, erased. Order here was not a question of discipline, but of survival. Without order, chaos would have become visible. The base commanding officer was in his early 40s. His hair already showed gray streaks. The uniform fit immaculately. He had been in this war too long to still be surprised, but not long enough to get used to it. Every morning, he stood before the board, before the room filled. It was a silent ritual. He held a clipboard under his arm, ran his finger along the entries, as if he could prevent one of them from staying through touch. On this day, one line stayed. The planned return time of the C-46A was exceeded, first by 10 minutes. No one reacted. Westbound flights were rarely on time. Headwinds ate time, clouds forced detours, radio contact was often patchy. The officer put a small check mark next to the line. Observe. Not yet a reason for concern. 20 minutes later, he looked at the board again. The chalk appeared brighter than the other entries. He checked his watch. Then the clipboard, the radio room, reported nothing unusual. Calls were made, routinely formulated. No answer came back, only the steady static that filled every frequency. An hour passed. Movement in the room increased. Voices became quieter, more concentrated. The officer set down the clipboard, briefly rubbed his eyes. Fatigue was a constant companion here, but it couldn't influence decisions. He had learned to ignore it. After 2 hours, the procedure changed. Not abruptly, but step by step. Other airfields along the route were contacted. No one reported an unplanned landing. No emergency approach. No damaged aircraft that had come down somewhere. A pilot who had landed shortly before reported extreme turbulence north of the standard route. Another mentioned heavy icing. Both were noted. Neither was extraordinary. The officer stepped up to the board again. He took the sponge in his hand. He hesitated. This hesitation was barely visible, but it was there. Then he wiped out the planned return time and wrote a single word next to it. Overdue. A technical term that asked no questions. A term that triggered processes. The formal search began. Other aircraft were instructed to look out during their flights. Pilots looked out of cockpits, searched for something that didn't belong to the landscape. A dark spot in the snow. A broken tree crown. Smoke. The Himalayan region revealed nothing. Rock, forest, and clouds swallowed every possibility of a clue. There was no distress call. No final message. No broken sentence. This absence of information made the situation paradoxical. Without a signal, there was no starting point. The missing aircrew report was prepared. Like countless before. The language was standardized, depersonalized. Later there would be a sentence that explained nothing and established everything. It simply disappeared. The officer knew what had to follow now. Every additional search flight tied up machines, crews, fuel. Every cancellation meant delay elsewhere. The war demanded movement. "We can't stop the flow," he said quietly to his deputy. It wasn't an order, more a statement. The flow was operations, tonnage, supply. The war didn't wait for certainty. In the evening, he put his signature on the first documents. The movement of his hand was calm, practiced. A name under a text that named no names. He briefly thought of the men on board. He didn't know all the faces. He knew the number. 13. Numbers were easier to bear than fates. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, another day began. In California, there was a knock at the Murphy family's door early in the morning. His mother was still holding the coffee cup when she opened. The man at the door wore a uniform. She immediately recognized what that meant. He spoke calmly, with a voice that had spoken these words many times before. Missing, not dead, not back. A stake between hope and loss. She sat down slowly, without consciously deciding. The cup remained untouched. The coffee grew cold. His father said nothing. He only nodded. Words would have established something that was still open. After the man left, the house remained quiet. Every sound seemed too loud. Every step echoed. In the following days, every mailbox was opened, as if a correction could be inside. An error. An addition. Murphy had promised to be back before the end of the year. Promises didn't automatically lose their validity just because time passed. That's how hope worked. The news also came to the Scherers. William's wife read the letter multiple times. She folded it, laid it on the table, picked it up again. Her son was too young to ask questions, but old enough to sense the change. She didn't tell him that the father was missing. She said, "He's on his way." It was easier to live with this formulation. At the base in Shibuya, the active search status was downgraded after a short time. Not out of indifference, but out of logic. No sightings, no wreckage. The terrain was considered inaccessible. Other losses pressed forward. New flight numbers appeared on the board. The officer went to the wall again. He wiped out the line with the C-46A. He didn't like doing it, but space was needed. New missions had to be planned. He knew this movement was final. Nevertheless, he performed it. Weeks passed. Months. The status changed. From missing to presumed fallen. 1 year and 1 day. A legal deadline. An administrative act. Insurance could be paid out. Widows received a legal status. No explanation. No place. In the Murphy house, a chair remained empty for a long time. His mother continued to set one plate too many, until one day, she didn't anymore. His father repaired things that weren't broken. Occupation was easier than waiting. Silence filled the rooms. At the Scherers, the father's place remained. Not used, but not removed. The son learned early that some questions weren't asked. He learned the word missing without understanding it. The war ended. Other men returned home. Streets filled with people, flags, music. For these families, the end brought no closure. Now that everything was over, there should have been answers. There were none. Years later, another notification came. A name, engraved in stone, at a distant place, Manila. A place for those without graves. It was something tangible, but it wasn't a place where you could stand and say, "Here he is." The historical silence consisted not of silence, but of routines that continued, of files that were closed, of people who learned to live with a condition that no one had explained. Memory remained. Movement continued. The machine had not returned. Operations continued. Part 3. Forensic Reconstruction. With the discovery of the wreckage, not the core of the story changed, but its temperature. Everything became colder. Up to this point, the disappearance had been carried by people, by memories, by the persistence of a son, by stories passed on because there was nothing else. Now the case entered a room that knew no stories, where nothing counted that wasn't proven, numbered, and reproducible. The phase of forensic reconstruction began not in the mountains, but at desks, under neon light. For the Defense POW, MIA Accounting Agency, the find was not an end, it was a shift. From unfindability to possibility, from hope to procedure. That a private team had located the wreckage was important, but not sufficient. Finding was not an official act. Acknowledging was, and acknowledging had rules. First, the find was treated as a dataset. Coordinates, elevation data, photographic documentation. The information was compared with known flight routes, with the mission plans of January 6, 1945. Did the location match the expected route? Was the altitude plausible? Did the position correspond to the known range of the aircraft in the reported weather conditions? Each comparison was a filter. Each filter could stop or forward the case. The status changed, not to resolved, to pursuable. A word that promised movement, but no result. In a laboratory in the United States, the actual work began. There sat a forensic analyst, early 30s, narrow shoulders, calm hands. She had never known anyone from the aircraft. She would never meet anyone either. Her relationship to the 13 men consisted of case numbers, of boxes, of reports that didn't smell of life, but of archives. She had a fixed routine. Every workday began the same. Put on gloves, open protocol, check evidence. Each fragment was labeled with the same movement. Label, number, date. No pause. No thinking about meaning. "We can't assume anything," she once said to a colleague while sealing a bag. "If we assume, we lose years." There was no harshness in her voice. It was experience. The reconstruction of the event began with what remained of the aircraft. Photos of the wreckage were printed in large format. Parts were marked. Structures identified. The distribution of debris told a limited story. No long trail, no indication of a controlled descent. The machine hadn't fallen apart while gliding. It had broken when it hit. This spoke for a high-speed impact, an event that left little time for reactions. No indications of an emergency landing. No signs that the crew had still been able to decide where they were going. It pointed to a moment that had been abrupt. Final. Fire was investigated separately. Many families had carried this fear for decades. The idea that a fire had broken out on board, high up, with no possibility of escape. The analysis showed traces of heat, but not in the form that indicated a fire during flight. No typical spread patterns, no large-scale charring. It wasn't proof of all clear, but it took the edge off, and imagination. In parallel, historical weather data were reevaluated. Reports from other crews from the same day, handwritten logbooks, meteorological records that had been incomplete at the time but gave clues. Strong vertical air movements, turbulence that lifted and dropped machines, icing at altitudes that couldn't be overflown. The analysts drew lines, compared time windows, marked correlations. No single trigger emerged. No moment that could be isolated. Instead, a chain of stresses, each known on its own, each seeming manageable on its own, but together, potentially deadly. The environment had made no mistake. It had simply existed. The machine itself brought its own limitations. The C-46 was capable but sensitive. Its engines demanded precise control. Its wings reacted sensitively to ice. In thin air, the margin for correction shrank. A small loss of lift could be enough. Or it didn't even need an error. Sometimes the combination of altitude, cold, and wind was enough. But all these findings remained technical. They explained probabilities, not experiences. They said nothing about how the last moment had felt, whether anyone had spoken, whether anyone had understood what was happening. Forensics ended where human experience began. Then came the most difficult part, the remains. The recovery conducted in November 2023 was not a heroic act. It was limited by time, weather, and terrain. The team had only a small window. What was recovered were not bodies. They were fragments, bone pieces, teeth, personal items whose assignment wasn't obvious, fabric remnants that had once been clothing. Each find was treated individually, packaged, numbered, photographed. The exact location was documented before the terrain was left to itself again. Nothing could be mixed. A single error would have compromised the entire analysis. In the laboratory, the fragments lost their fine location. They became samples. The analyst laid them out carefully. She changed gloves regularly. Proximity was dangerous. Proximity led to assumptions. She had learned to maintain distance without becoming indifferent. It was a narrow line. She labeled bags. She made sketches. She measured, weighed, compared. Some fragments were too degraded to provide more than their existence. Others still contained traces, fragile hints of identity. Each find was a promise and a risk. DNA analysis was the critical point. After more than 7 decades, soil, moisture, and temperature fluctuations had done their work. Many samples provided no usable material. Others provided only fragments, sufficient for exclusion, not always for confirmation. Science demanded certainty. Families demanded names. Even when genetic material could be obtained, the next hurdle remained: reference samples. Immediate relatives had long since died. Parents, spouses, siblings. What remained were distant relatives, people who knew the name but not the person. The search for them was its own reconstruction. Genealogical research, church registers, old address books, careful phone calls that began with long pauses. "We believe you might be related to." Some conversations ended quickly. Others became quiet. Not everyone wanted to open old stories. Not everyone could. For some, the war was something they only knew from stories. For others, it was still present. For Bill Scherer, this phase was harder than anything before. The wreckage was found, the place existed, and yet everything seemed to stall again. The language that now reached him was cautious, scientific. Analysis ongoing, no clear assignment yet. No promises, no deadlines. He read these communications with the same care as the telegrams before. But they felt different. Earlier, ignorance had prevailed. Now there was knowledge that wasn't enough. He wondered whether his mother would have endured this state better, or whether it would have finally broken her. The analyst didn't think of Bill Scherer. She thought of comparison values, of contamination, of statistical certainty. And yet she had gotten into the habit of pausing briefly at the end of a workday. She looked at the labeled bags, 13 men, 13 lives, reduced to what was provable. "I hope we make progress," she once said quietly. Not as a commitment, as a human remainder in a technical process. Forensic reconstruction couldn't reenact the last flight. It couldn't bring back voices, decisions, thoughts. It could only say what hadn't happened and what probably had happened. And even that, with reservation. What it could provide was a bridge between place and name, between fragment and memory. But bridges needed time, and time was what the families had long lacked. At the end of this phase stood no closure, no official act, only another status that promised movement and meant standstill. Analysis ongoing. Science moved forward. Certainty remained behind. Part 4. The human truth. The moment when a case officially receives active status sounds like movement, like progress, like something that's finally resolving. In the language of authorities, this word is factual, almost hopeful. For the families of the 13 men, however, it meant something fundamentally different. It didn't mean arrival. It meant shift. A transition from complete uncertainty to a form of knowledge that offered no comfort. For Bill Scherer, this transition came quietly. No call with breakthrough, no sentence that changed everything. Just a letter, soberly formulated, with a new line that hadn't been there before. Status, active. He read this sentence multiple times. It sounded like present tense, like action. But his father had not been part of the present for decades. Active were not the men. Active were the files. Bill sat at the table where his mother used to sit. The table still stood in the same place in the room. The wood was smooth at the edges, where hands had rested over years. Bill had gotten into the habit of always spreading out the documents the same way. He aligned the corners, laid the sheets next to each other, never on top of each other. Order wasn't a need for control, but protection. As long as the papers were ordered, the space in his head also remained limited. He ran his finger over the new line. Active. The word felt foreign. It promised nothing concrete. It only meant that something was running. Somewhere. Without time frame. Without guarantee. The names of the men still stood on the wall of the missing in Manila. Stone, bright, smooth, unchangeable. Bill had never been there. He had hesitated for a long time. The place felt final, as long as nothing was final. But he knew every photo. He knew the order of the names. He knew exactly where his father's name stood. And he knew that next to this name, there was still no bronze rosette. This small marking, barely larger than a coin, separated two states. Missing. Returned. For visitors, it was a detail. For families, it was everything. It was the only visible sign that someone had not only been found, but truly returned. A descendant of the Murphy family, middle-aged, actually stood before this wall years after the discovery of the wreckage. She had come alone, without family, without ceremony. She held her phone in her hand, took a photo, not of the entire wall, but only of one name, Sidney L. Murphy. She had developed this habit of capturing the name, as if she had to prove it was still there. The stone felt cool, even in the sun. She briefly laid her hand on it, then pulled it back again. It wasn't a place where you stayed long. We knew he was gone, she said quietly, almost apologetically. We just didn't know where. This sentence had accompanied her all her life. It had always been true. Now it was true in a different way. For her, the discovery of the wreckage was not a homecoming. It was a correction of the void. Her great-uncle was no longer somewhere. He was there, in the mountains, at a place she would probably never see, a place that existed but wasn't reachable. Not for grief, not for farewell. The human truth of this phase lay exactly here. Knowledge didn't restore anything. It explained, but it didn't heal. Knowing where someone ended didn't bring back when they were missing. The lost years couldn't be made up. The conversations couldn't be had. The decisions couldn't be shared. Knowledge was precise but cold. For Bill Scherer, This became especially clear when he thought of his mother. She had spent her life in a state that would later be called ambiguous loss. She had hoped without saying it. She had waited without admitting it. She had lived every day as if something could change, without ever saying concretely what. When Bill visited her grave, he wondered whether the certainty he now had would have helped her, or whether it would only have made the waiting final. He couldn't answer this question. He only knew that she could no longer hear the answer. The letters from the authorities that now arrived were precisely formulated. Careful. Legally clean. No promises. No time specifications. Analysis ongoing. Further steps depend on reference samples. Every sentence was correct. Every sentence left room. Room for delay. Room for renewed waiting. Bill filed these letters. He had learned that paper was patient. People were less so. Patience had an end, even when it stretched over decades. For other families, this transition proceeded differently. Some began to speak openly for the first time about the men they had lost. Photos were brought out. Stories told that couldn't be told before because they would have fallen into emptiness. Now there was a place where these stories could end, not happily, but concretely. Other families reacted oppositely. They withdrew. For them, the new certainty was too heavy. It had solved nothing, only confirmed that everything was over. Hope, vague as it had been, had at least allowed movement. Certainty was still. There was no common reaction, no collective relief. Only individual ways of dealing with something that came too late to still be formative. Truth came not at a time when it could have influenced decisions. It came when the decisions had long been made. The human truth was also that responsibility had shifted. The state had registered the loss early. It had administered, categorized, archived it. It had followed procedures. The return of the story hadn't originated from this administration, but from the persistence of individuals. Now the state was part of the process again, slow, rule-bound, distant. No one spoke openly of failures, but they were palpable, in conversations, in pauses, in the cautious tone with which every piece of information was passed on. In the unspoken question, what do you owe families when certainty only arrives after they've built their lives without it? Bill often asked himself this question. He didn't ask it to the authorities. He asked it to himself. He had spent so much time finding a place that he now didn't know what to do with this place. He couldn't travel there. He couldn't change anything. He could only know. He began to perceive things differently. Everyday routines gained different weight. He caught himself looking at old photos longer, not just of his father, but of himself as a child. He wondered who he would have become if his father had returned. He had never allowed himself this question before. Now it couldn't be suppressed anymore. The Murphy family descendant left the memorial in Manila without ceremony. She didn't turn around again. The name remained where it was, without rosette, without change. She knew that could change one day. But she also knew that day wouldn't change anything in her own life. Recognition would come late. Too late to be formative. That was one of the bitterest insights of this phase. That homecoming is a point in time, not a condition. And that some points in time are missed, not out of malice, but out of inertia, distance, and priority. The names remained in the stone. The files remained open. The people who had waited longest were no longer there to receive the result. That was the human truth that couldn't be captured in reports. That clarification isn't always redemption, and that some answers only come when no one knows where to put them anymore. The story moved forward, but it still didn't arrive. Part 5. What remained? What remained in the end was no closure. It was a condition. While files were passed on, while laboratories worked and status reports were updated, something persisted that submitted to no procedure. Something that couldn't be numbered, sealed, concluded. It remained in places never intended for reports, and with people who had never been asked whether they wanted to be part of this story. High up in the mountains, near that border that existed on maps but was hardly perceptible in the terrain, lived a hunter whose age no one knew exactly. He had never given one. For him, time wasn't measured in years, but in rainy seasons, in dry periods, in the change of paths. The mountains were his clock, his calendar, his history. He had been born there. He would stay there. That was as fixed for him as the rocks themselves. He knew the aircraft, not as a type, not as a mission, as a place. It was always there, he said when asked many years later. He said it without pathos, without mystery. The way one talks about a large rock that has always lain by the path. For him, the wreckage hadn't been an event, no break in history. It had become part of the landscape, something you went around, something you used, something that was simply there, like rain in autumn and snow in winter. From a piece of aluminum, he had crafted himself a knife. The handle was simple. Made of wood, he had worked himself. The blade was thin, surprisingly sharp, with an edge he regularly sharpened. He used it daily, for cutting ropes, for skinning game, for opening sacks, for carving small tools. The metal was light and resistant, better than much of what he could buy in the villages below. He didn't know where the aircraft had come from. He only knew it had fallen, that people had been in it. The elders had told that when he was still a child, that was enough. He didn't need to know more. For him, the wreckage belonged to no one. It was simply there. The mountains took what fell. They gave nothing back. Ownership was a different idea here, shaped by different conditions. What lay in the forest became part of the forest. What the mountain received, the mountain kept. This wasn't philosophy. This was fact. When strangers came, men with backpacks, with equipment, with notebooks, with faces showing effort and determination, he observed them from a distance. He helped when they asked. He showed paths, warned of cliffs, explained where the ground was treacherous, where stones lay loose, where you lost orientation in fog, not out of reverence for the dead, but out of courtesy toward the living. For him, nothing changed through their coming. The wreckage remained. The mountains remained. Memory remained oral, passed down from generation to generation, without documents, without proof, without official confirmation. This local memory had never disappeared. It had only been stored differently. Not in archives, not in databases, not in sealed envelopes, but in narratives, in paths that were avoided, in places where children were told, "Don't play there, sharp metal lies there." Not out of respect for history, not out of mourning for the fallen, but out of caution, aluminum cut. That was the reason. That was enough. Meanwhile, far away, in houses with manicured front yards and framed photographs on walls, families continued to wait. For results, for names, for something that could be concluded. Identification still hadn't been completed. Samples were compared. DNA profiles analyzed. New reference lines drawn. The process moved forward, slowly, indifferent to age or patience. Bureaucracy knew no hurry. It only knew correctness. For Bill Scherer, this waiting now became physically palpable. No longer as an abstract question, but as concrete fatigue, as a burden that grew heavier with each year. He noticed that his time was no longer open, that the future was becoming shorter than the past, that the answers he had hoped for might only come when he was no longer there to hear them. This realization changed something in him. He began to pass things on. Folders, with carefully organized documents, copies of letters. His handwritten notes, collected over decades. Not out of resignation, but out of precaution. In case someone else had to take over. In case the story should be told further. In case there was still an answer that could be found. He told his grandson in detail for the first time about his great-grandfather. Not as a hero, as happened in old war films. Not as a victim, as modern narratives demanded. As a man who had boarded and not come back. As someone who had worn a uniform, who had followed orders, who had disappeared. The boy listened attentively, asked few questions. For him, the war was something abstract, something from history books, something without reality. But the story stuck. It was now part of his origin, even though it had no closure, even though it would never have one. The authorities continued to work. They did what they always did. They followed procedures. They updated files. They kept protocols. They sent status reports. The case remained active. That was correct. That was important. But activity didn't mean urgency. It only meant the case hadn't disappeared. It was administered, cataloged, part of a system that never stopped, but also never accelerated. In Manila, the wall remained unchanged. The American cemetery, maintained by gardeners who took their work seriously, who cut hedges and planted flowers. The stone aged slower than people. Names didn't fade. Next to Sidney L. Murphy, there was still no rosette, not because he had been forgotten, but because the last formal threshold hadn't yet been crossed. A small act that meant everything and could bring nothing back. A symbol that was important for administration, but not for truth. In the Murphy family, the name had long detached from the person. Younger relatives didn't know the man. They had never known him. They would never know him. They knew the story. A photo, black and white. The edges yellowed. A few sentences repeated at family gatherings. A place overseas that no one had ever visited. The name had become part of the family without ever having been part of everyday life. A footnote, an anecdote, a gap in the family tree. And yet something new remained, something unexpected. During late evaluation of recovered materials, years after the actual recovery, a note fragment appeared. Not an official document, not evidence in the narrow legal sense. A piece of paper, heavily damaged, the edges disintegrated, the surface stained by moisture and time, deformed by decades in the earth. It had been found near the former cabin, between metal parts and rotted fabric. The writing was done in pencil, barely legible, almost vanished. No farewell, no name, no complete sentence, just a single word. West. The analysts couldn't say who had written it, or when exactly. Whether it had been a note, a marking, a thought in a last moment. It was too fragmentary to be officially interpreted, too incomplete for scientific conclusions. It was noted in a report. With a date, with a question mark, nothing more. Scientifically, it had no value. Humanly, it was something else. For the families who learned of it, this word was a remainder. No proof of anything. No comfort that eased pain, but a hint of action, of orientation, of someone who had still tried to hold a course, of consciousness in a moment of chaos. It replaced nothing. It changed no facts, but it added something that had been missing before. A human moment. Proof that there had been people there, not just names on lists. Forensic work approached its end without clearly reaching it. Some identifications succeeded. DNA matched. Names could be assigned. Families received calls. Others remained open. Not all names could be safely assigned. Science had reached its limit. Not out of negligence, not out of indifference, but out of time. Material decayed. DNA became unreadable. Comparison possibilities ended. When no relatives lived anymore, when no samples existed anymore. The wreckage remained in the mountains. Parts had been recovered, cataloged, packed, stored. Much remained behind, too heavy, too large, too scattered. The hunter continued to use his knife. It was well balanced. The blade held its sharpness. It fulfilled its purpose. For him, it carried no guilt, only history. It was a tool, nothing more, nothing less. What remained was no final line. It was a persistence. Some families decided to set their own point. Small ceremonies, private, without official recognition. A date they chose, a name they spoke, a place they imagined, because they could never visit it. Others continued to wait, for the rosette, for the call, for a document that made something final, for closure that might never come. The story had shifted, away from the event itself, away from the day of the crash, toward what endured, to the people who continued, to the objects that remained, to the questions without answers. Not every loss needs a solution to be real. Not every solution comes in time to have meaning. Not every story has an ending that can be written. What remained was metal in the mountain, scattered, rusted, become part of the earth. Stone in Manila. Names in rows, some with rosettes, others without. Files in motion, from agency to agency, from generation to generation. Active, but not urgent. A knife in the everyday life of a hunter. Sharp, useful, without meaning except its function. A word on a piece of paper. Unreadable for most. Significant for few. And people who had learned to live with a truth that wasn't round. That had no clear edges. That couldn't be put into words that did justice to everyone. People who had understood that some questions got no answers, that some wounds didn't heal, that some stories didn't end, but only stopped being told. That was what remained. Not closure, not peace, not forgetting, but persistence. In the following years, parallel realities developed around the same event. For the scientists, it was a case. Number 347. Active, incomplete. With data that had to be analyzed. With samples that could be compared. With reports that had to be written. Their work was methodical, distant, objective. That's how it had to be. Emotions didn't help with DNA analysis. Tears didn't change facts. For the families, it was something else. A name, a face, a voice that faded, an absence that remained. They read the reports that arrived. They interpreted every word. They searched for hope in technical formulations. They learned terms they never wanted to learn. Mitochondrial DNA, reference samples, positive identification. For the hunter in the mountains, it remained a place, part of his world. The knife lay ready at hand next to his fireplace. He sharpened it regularly, on a stone that was smooth from years of use. The metal held well, better than the cheap iron from the village shops. He sometimes wondered whether other parts of the aircraft could be just as useful. But he only took what he needed. The mountains taught sufficiency. What happened to questions that couldn't be answered? In the end, no moment remained that could be named. No date when everything was concluded. The machine had found a place. The names hadn't left it. In Manila, they still stood in the stone, evenly engraved, unmoved by the course of decades. Visitors passed by, read, paused, moved on. For most, they were names among many. For a few, they were lifelines that ended abruptly, without explanation, without farewell. Next to some names shone a small rosette. Next to others, not. The difference was barely visible. The meaning was, in the mountains, the terrain remained quiet. The forest continued to grow. Rain came, fog moved in, paths shifted, metal rusted slowly. Not everything had been recovered. Not everything should be. The place was no memorial. It had simply remained. For the families, the story hadn't ended. It had only slowed down. Some had learned to live with knowledge that had come too late. Others continued to wait, even though they knew time was working against them. Certainty no longer had a fixed point in time. It had become something you passed on, like a name, like a narrative. Bill Scherer knew he might not experience the closure. He knew it without saying it. He had done what he could. He had found the place. He had never asked for more. Whether the state would one day take the last step was no longer in his hands. Second Lieutenant Sidney L. Murphy remained officially missing, even though they knew where he was. Found, but not brought back. Located, but not ended. His name carried the story forward, even though the man had long become part of the landscape that had received him. Perhaps what remains is not the result, but the trace. Not the answer, but the path toward it. The machine has arrived in history. The people have not. And somewhere between stone, metal, and memory holds the echo of a promise that no one consciously broke, and that nevertheless could never be fulfilled.